Okay, so if we fully acknowledge that virtual reality is just not that great yet, it still has a long way to go, then the question is, why should a business enter the market right now? Why should a consumer not wait to buy the next version of headset? Why couldn't they wait until it sheds its flaws and then realizes all the potential that it has? Now that's one strategy. And later, we're going to talk about the benefits and possibilities of early adoption. But to set the stage for that discussion, let's look at some of the earlier technologies and understand the timeline that had in terms of early adoption and all the different ways that the technology improved to eventually realize its potential. And then we'll turn around and look at virtual reality and see if it will follow a very similar path. So let's get into the slides. Okay, so let's use prior technology examples yet again. So we'll start with the PC, and then for each tech type, we're going to divide them into 3 categories or time periods. And that'll be initial release, mass adoption, and then the third is maturation and quality. So each stage takes time, and during these stages, there's constant improvement. So like I said, let's start with the PC. So within these 3 different categories, what was the PC like? What was the history of that release? So the very first thing was that PCs got released sometime around the early 80s, and that's when both IBM as well as Apple at the time started to release their very first consumer PCs. And at the time, not much happened. The tech took a super long time to become usable by a mass audience. In fact, it took over a decade in that initial release stage. Eventually, something happened though. And around the time when the Windows operating systems, the Intel processors, and all the IBM copy PCs started coming about, all of a sudden it was ripe for mass adoption. And what happened during that time? Price came down, things improved quickly, and many entered the market. So hardware companies, software companies, connectivity companies, until eventually that mass adoption stage ended, and we got to that point where laptops and desktops were more or less at a parity. And it was kind of a commodity where there wasn't much innovation coming from the PC sector anymore. Now, the last piece of innovation that happened there was tablets. And basically, it wasn't any new features there. It was a touch screen, it was smaller, but it still really did all the same things that a PC did. Now, since tablets have come out and really on into the future, there's not really much room for innovation. The initial release took a long time. It took a bit of time for mass adoption to take place, and that really spanned another decade. And once maturation came about, really the focus was on quality and making sure that there was a reliability in terms of performance. So for the PC, when it started in the early 80s and it really reached maturation, around the 2000s timeframe, that's over 2 decades. It took a long time for it really to come about and to be a useful thing for consumers. Now the internet had a very similar life cycle. So it started when it was originally released as a business-only venture. At that time, it was used to enter and share information and to do research. It was used for electronic communication, and then also for tech development and collaboration. But the number of people that used it were very small. It was business, a couple government agencies, and that was really about it. As it got into mass adoption, it took quite a bit of time as well. And suddenly the dial-up services is what enabled the common person to go about and actually start using the internet, because everyone had telephone connectivity, so they were able to use the internet using that technology and infrastructure. So all of the companies that provided dial-up services suddenly came about, and that really fueled that mass adoption. Now, as it got into maturation, that's when broadband and Ethernet came about. That's when all of a sudden wireless became the big thing. And as it got into the quality stage, it became 4G, where wireless was everywhere in every device that you owned, whether it be your PC, your mobile device, even your TV. Now the Internet of Things is coming about and all consumer devices will connect over the internet. It's at that maturation stage, but it took many decades to get there. Now mobile, another good example. A long, long time ago, car phones were invented, and they just were hooked up to your car and they didn't really travel anywhere that your car didn't go. Now that was actually invented in the 1940s, but in the 1970s it really hit popularity. The first mobile phone call was actually done in 1973, but it took a long time for it to hit that mass adoption. Eventually, though, 2G phones came out in the early 90s, so 2 decades after the original first call was made. and then it became popular at that mass level. Now, it took many years later for initial smartphones to come out, and that was more about network quality and phone design for a long time. Remember the flip phones? Remember all of those different phones where you would hit the button many times to send a text message and to do text on the phone? But smartphones came about in the late 90s and early 2000s. But it wasn't until 2007, until the iPhone was released, that it really hit that level of quality. And since that time, yes, there's been innovation, there's been an improvement in quality, some new features, but for the most part, the innovation has kind of reached its peak. And most of the improvement these days is just about quality and incremental improvement. But from the 1970s, when those first car phones were made, it really, really took a long time for it to improve and to hit that mass adoption stage. Okay, a couple more quick examples. So you also have computing applications. So computing applications started as floppy disks. It eventually, in mass adoption, it really hit that CD software, and you had all the different versions that would come out every year or so. Eventually, you could just download the applications online because connectivity allowed you to do that. And then, these days, software is often being sold as a service. That's how it hit the maturation stage. For something else, like business internet use, initially, it was about internal efficiency. People would use it internally to store information and share data. Eventually, when mass adoption came about, it was about the information age and doing e-commerce over the internet. At some point, every single business was online, both within their internal structure as well as externally in terms of customer-facing and business-to-business sales. And at some point, a startup frenzy became a very normal thing, and suddenly every company suddenly wanted a mobile app and all these interesting applications online. So that's how business internet kind of reached that maturity stage. And then finally, we had consumer internet use. So at the very beginning, people would use internet for gaming. Eventually, it became used for communication. It started with emails, it went into the chat rooms, text messages, and all of a sudden now social media. Then, every single thing that we do in terms of consumerism is primarily done online. Whether you're buying online, researching things online, or you're just getting ideas about what products to purchase. Some things are entirely online. But that's how mass adoption took place. And it reached that maturity stage where today we can't even imagine life without connectivity to the internet. Everything is online, and we use it in such a consumer-friendly way. So what's the example in all of these things? Everything took a little bit of time to get started. Some things more than others, like the PC or mobile phones. But eventually it hit that mass adoption stage as technology improved, as new things got released, as more players and developers got involved in the industry. And as mass adoption happened, suddenly things moved very, very quickly into that maturation stage because there were so many people that realized the market opportunity and competed within it. And once it hit that maturation stage, then, gosh, life changed completely in all of these different ways. So we see VR taking a very, very similar path. So let's talk about that very quickly. So why is it important for VR? As we said before, the VR hardware, software, business use, and consumer use is probably going to follow a very similar pattern using those three phases of its adoption. So it'll start with the initial release, which was not so long ago. Eventually it will hit mass adoption, and then it will mature. Now, there's one key difference between VR and some of the other examples that we used. Right now, we have so much more money and investment. We have so many people with developer type of qualities, with the expertise to go code and create something on their own. And we have a much better visualization of the technology's potential. Likewise, this exists worldwide, and it's not exclusive to Silicon Valley or just big companies with a lot of money. It's not exclusive to government. Anybody can enter this market. Anyone can create a VR app. Anyone can learn these skills and apply them to a mass consumption level. Timelines compared to mobile phones and PCs, where it took multiple decades, are going to be vastly accelerated because of all of these reasons. So the question is, what's our prediction? How do we see the timeline shaping out for VR? Let's take a look. Now, this is a prediction, so it may be a little bit different, but more or less, this is the path we see. So it's going to start off with gaming and very limited use, and that's what we see today, actually. Most of the applications for VR are games or experiences or something related to the entertainment industry. But as the years go on, as technology improves and more people are working on this, we see that expanding outside of gaming, very similar to how the internet did. So it'll start to be used primarily for communication, for education and learning, and even for commerce. Marketing will get started within these different industries. And once all that money and all of these different uses are really getting started and available for the consumer, we see that driving mass adoption. Now, at some point, VR is going to replace screens altogether. The mobile phones, the TVs, the computers, anything with a screen, with a constraint on how large it can be, is going to be replaced by the much more immersive, much higher quality VR. And at some point, we really see that happening where life will stop without connectivity. And VR will be the norm. Just like we think of mobile phones today, VR will be in everybody's life and will change absolutely everything. So where are we today? We're right at that initial release stage. We think it's going to move through initial release a lot sooner than mobile phones did, for example, but it's a complicated technology, so it'll probably take a bit of time. If we had to guess in terms of timeline, I would say within 5 years we'll hit the mass adoption stage, and then probably another 3 to 5 years we'll hit the maturation and quality stage. So that's an estimate. It could be sooner, it could be later, but roughly I would say the next 3 to 5 years, it'll see us move through the initial release phase into mass adoption. Now, in the next couple of sections, we're going to talk about what that's going to entail. What can VR do today, and how is that going to change in terms of hardware, in terms of software, in terms of all the different uses that it can be done for? Let's go into that in the next couple of videos.